Today, I'm going to make a proposal for research. The question, is a sport-specific mid-range flexibility best for injury prevention? My name is Anthony Davis. I am currently enrolled in the Masters of Science in Exercise Science at Concordia St. Paul. I'm also enrolled at Northwestern Health Sciences University doing my Doctor of Chiropractic degree. So today we're looking at the potential relationship between flexibility and injury risk. We want to understand if flexibility impacts injury risk, or maybe it doesn't. And because there's conflicting information in the literature, where some literature suggests high levels of flexibility are going to leave a person more prone to injury, and some suggest that low values increase injury risk, maybe a mid-range of flexibility is best for injury reduction. If there is a relationship, or if there's a lack of a relationship, this is going to train how coaches and trainers, physical therapists, chiropractors, etc., train people in the field. And this is important to evaluate because continually in the research, there is a poor correlation between flexibility and not only injury risk, but other important health outcomes. So currently in practice, there is a practice of, encouraging flexibility as a primary component of fitness, but this does not match what the literature suggests that flexibility has value for. So increasing flexibility often shows no risk reduction. There are many studies that show that people who are more flexible do not have fewer injuries. Usually they perform about the same as their peers who are less flexible. In fact, sometimes people who are hypermobile actually have higher risk. So if the common conception is that more flexibility is better for injury reduction, well, actually having too much flexibility may increase the risk. And some studies have shown that high and low values of flexibility both predict injury risk, in which case we might need to form guidelines for flexibility that are more similar to what has been done with body mass index, where being extremely overweight or underweight are both unhealthy, and the same may be true for flexibility, where being extremely hypermobile or hypomobile might increase your injury risk. In order to conduct a study on this topic, we would prefer 130 runners. That would be 65 sprinters and 65 long-distance runners. Actually, we only need 114 for 80% power, but that accounts for dropouts. Now, we would recruit from the local track and field teams, and the team sports offers sort of a discipline and that would allow to reduce confounding variables and allow for consistency within the study. We would exclude anyone with previous injuries because we want to look at primary prevention, and we know that previous injury is the single largest or most impactful predictor of future injury. So we want to make sure that that's not interfering. And then we would exclude anyone with interfering pathology like rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, etc. And we would predict that by looking at sprinters and long-distance runners, that they are similar enough that we don't have confounding variables. For example, from comparing a contact to a non-contact sport, there are way too many confounding variables there. So sprinters and long-distance runners, they're both just running, but sprinters need a longer stride length, and therefore they may need more flexibility. And that if a sprinter, in other words, the upper echelon of how much flexibility a sprinter needs might be higher than what a marathon runner needs. Similar to what we find with performance, for example, where marathon runners who have too much flexibility are actually less efficient runners and they have worse performance. Well, we might expect the same thing with injury risk as well, where we have a range of flexibility that is beneficial to sprinters that is different than the range of flexibility that is beneficial to long distance runners. In order to measure this, we would look at hamstrings and ankle flexibility. For hamstrings, we'll do a V sit and reach, which has really high reliability. And then for ankle flexibility, we chose the distance to wall. Again, high reliability, even for novice raters. So anybody who even is untrained could perform these measurements and have good reliability. In order to do so, flexibility would be assessed 3 times. So once before, once at 8 weeks, and once after the season. And measurements would be taken with no warm-up of any kind and performed by an independent rater. It would be preferable to have a single rater perform all of the measurements to maintain internal validity of the study. Injury data would be collected monthly into a central database, and this would be collected by the players' coaches. And this is part of the benefit of having organized team sports. And then record as either acute or overuse. And then no intervention is actually given. So no advice, no intervention of any kind. This is simply observational. In order to analyze the data, independent t-tests help compare flexibility and injury between the groups. My apologies there. Pearson product moment correlation coefficients help to examine the strength of the relationship. The linear regression analysis helps to help make predictions between variables. Receiver operating characteristic curves help to analyze the sensitivity and specificity of variables. And then most importantly here is the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variables, plural there, we are looking at hyper and hypomobility, so flexibility on a range, and then sport, so we're comparing sprinters to long distance. And we're looking at if those things impact the dependent variable, which is in injury risk. Now, we imagine 3 possible scenarios. The original prediction is that both high and low values of flexibility will predict injury risk, and that range will be different between sports, that sprinters will need a higher range of flexibility than marathon runners will. If this is the case, then we would need to tailor flexibility to the individual sport rather than having generic guidelines of range of motion. For example, the hamstrings with a straight leg needs to have 90 degrees of flexibility. Well, perhaps for marathon runners, actually they do better with about 70 degrees of range of motion. This is a hypothetical scenario, of course. And in that case, we sort of look at it like we find a Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, not too flexible, not too immobile either. Second scenario is that high and low values do predict injury risk, but it's not sport specific. So it doesn't matter if you're a marathon runner or a sprinter, that for injury risk reduction alone, that both groups actually need the same range of flexibility. Now that would be easier to form flexibility guidelines because you just have a single range. However, this would create problems for performance because previous literature has shown that, for example, with marathoners, hypermobility reduces their running economy and reduces their performance. So coaches would need to balance the research on injury risk reduction with the value to performance, and they may have to make some sort of compromise as a result. And the third scenario, which frankly is likely because a lot of research does end with, hey, there's no relationship. Well, maybe there's no relationship. And if that is the case, then I think that this would free up coaches and trainers and PTs and chiros to focus on more high impact interventions like strength. Lorson et al. 2014 showed remarkably that strength training was able to reduce injury risk by less than a third. That is remarkable. And then in the same study, they compared it to flexibility training for injury risk reduction, and flexibility training did nothing for injury risk reduction. So maybe focusing on things that have a higher effect size, like strength training, is a better use of time. Limitations of this study include the fact that it is observational, so we cannot determine causality. And we did not track performance. So if we need to weigh the benefits of flexibility for injury risk reduction versus flexibility for performance, then we are unable to compare those. And then there's limited generalizability outside running. This is a narrow scope of study, and so without looking at other sports or the general population, it has limited generalizability. Recommendations for further research. It would be important, as I mentioned, to track performance. So if that balance needs to be made, if those judgment calls need to be made, then we have the information to do so. An experimental design would be critical here so that we can determine causality. For example, you might take a group, a team, and you look at the people who are extremely hypermobile and the people who are extremely hypomobile. And the people who are hypermobile don't do any flexibility training. The people who are hypomobile do a lot of flexibility training, and the people who are in the middle do sort of a standard program. And you compare that to a non to an intervention that just looks like more is better, and you see we would predict that perhaps that has a better result, sort of customizing it depending on a person's actual flexibility relative to their sports. And then we can include more sports so it is more generalizable. In conclusion, Nuzzo et al. In 2019 did a really nice review, just a narrative review, but they summarized how flexibility does not produce meaningful results for most major health outcomes. And this is important because this challenges some of the preconceived notions and practice of flexibility training, which is that more is better. Well, more is not better. And it does not produce, again, meaningful outcomes for most markers of health. And so Nuzzo really challenged the idea that flexibility needs to be incorporated as a primary component of fitness. And if no relationship exists, if flexibility does not really produce meaningful changes in our overall health or in our injury risk reduction or anything, then I think this is actually a good thing. This is a good thing because it produces confirmation that humans are not so fragile that we can be easily influenced by a little change in flexibility here or there. And perhaps more importantly, we can reallocate time towards more important training interventions, as previously mentioned, like strength training, which has a higher effect size and a higher impact on, not just performance, but also injury risk reduction. Here are the references that were used in this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.